Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon on creating neuro-inclusive schools, which is a subject that I am super passionate about and I cannot wait to talk to you more about as part of this afternoon's proceedings. So I can see everyone filing in, which is so lovely to see. So many people signed up today. So much interest in this. I think it's becoming a really hot topic. We know that we cannot meet the needs of all children in current mainstream schools, but I do believe, I really truly do believe that we can if we look at redesigning the way that we serve our communities. So it's so wonderful to have you all here today. I just want to make an introduction to somebody in the chat. My colleague Pranal Pillay is in the chat. She is a wonderful tech guru. So if you're getting stuck with any of the tech today, please do call on her. She's also going to be posting all sorts of links into the chat of references for our handout, how to access the interactive element and all these type of things. So please do look out for Pranal in the chat. She is fully endorsed by myself and really looking forward to taking you through the slides today. So let's get started. If I can find one, there we are, super. Wonderful. Okay. So you're in the right place. We are doing a webinar on creating neuro-inclusive schools. And I would just like to say to people that these slides are like this for a reason. We do this, they don't quite fit in the box because the children that we serve don't quite fit in boxes. And so it's a bit of a metaphor here. So it's not because we haven't got very good design eyes on us at Connections in Mind. It's really just trying to reinforce that idea of not all children fit in the boxes that we expect them to. So today we're talking about creating neuro-inclusive schools, and we're going to be using Mentimeter, which we do often in our presentations. So if you've ever had a presentation from me before, you will be familiar with Mentimeter. And if you haven't, please do get involved. You'll deepen your learning, you'll get to get involved in the content, and you'll help me really get to understand our audience rather than just me speaking about what the research shows. So please do get involved. You can either click on the link in the chat, or you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can go to menti.com on any internet browser and you can type in the code when you get there, 38296302. So there's 3 different ways that you can access this, and hopefully that's working for you all. I can see that Pranal has put the link into the chat. She'll continue to do that throughout the session because there will be new people who are joining us as always, and unfortunately you cannot see the old chat when you've just joined. It's kind of hidden, so we do need to keep popping that in there. So that's why it will be coming up a lot of times. If you have managed to make it on there, please do like the bottom corner of the page. There should be like a heart button on there for you. So just like that, then that tells me that we've managed to get people accessing. Look at that. We've got 6 people, 7, more and more people coming in, and we've got loads more than that online with us today. So please do get involved. I promise you will learn more if you do get involved in this and not just a bystander in the process. So thank you so much for getting involved. Super, so just a bit of a housekeeping for us. It's going to be an interactive presentation, so do click on that Menti link and do get involved. And there's a handout which Pranal has posted into the chat as well. It's yours to download and print off at your will, with lots of clickable hyperlinks to things that you might find useful. So do take a look at that, and all the salient information that you need from today's presentation too. The aims for this talk are going to be for us to understand the SEND provision landscape in the UK especially, but I believe it is very similar around the world, and the importance of neuroinclusion, why it's important, to know the link between executive functions, which is my passion area, neurodiversity and trauma, understanding why connection, relationships and belonging are fundamental to personal development and child development specifically, and finally a compassionate whole school approach which can help every child to flourish, which is, I know, what we all deep down want out of education. Super. So I want to get to know you all a bit better. So who am I talking to today? So using your Mentimeter. So if you have just joined us, or if you're not sure how this works, please just do go to the chat and click on the link that says Menti direct link. Just click on that link and then you'll be able to participate in creating some of the slides that we're going to be creating today. So I'm interested to know who we've got with us. So lots of others, which is very interesting. We've got one parent. I'm sure there are more than one parent here because I'm sure we've got many roles. But we've got senior leaders, we've got Senkos, learning support specialists, a whole host of different people. And as I said earlier, we have got lots of people online today, but I can see only 16 people have filled this out. So please do get involved. It is really beneficial to everyone to get to see all the different perspectives of different members of a school environment, including the others. And I'd love to know who those others are. So if you want to pop into the chat what your role is or how you define your role, that would be really helpful for me to understand a bit more about those others. An ADHD coach, SEND advisor. Okay, super. Thank you very much. That gives me a bit of an idea of who we're talking to. Thank you so much. Right. Okay. So my name is Victoria Bagnall and I'm one of the co-founders of Connections in Mind and currently our head of training and professional development. I am dyslexic, which means that I'm neurodivergent, and I, despite my dyslexia, I did manage to get to the University of Cambridge to read geography. I'm a qualified secondary geography teacher and also a mother of three gorgeous girls. I've got a 13-year-old, a 9-year-old and a 5, almost 6-year-old. As I mentioned, co-founder of Connections in Mind and also an organisation called The Code, which offers executive function coaching. I was going to say coaching, that's what we do. No, tutoring. Yeah, so involved in lots of things, as many neurodivergent people are, and super passionate about the work that we do. Thank you for everyone putting in their others. Play therapists I can see coming up, such an valuable interventions. Fair access officer, super. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I always like to start these presentations by just telling you a little bit about my story. And a Connections in Mind, we think of our light bulb moment as the moment when you find out about executive functioning and everything that you have struggled with or the people in your care have struggled with kind of comes into focus and you have a bit of that aha moment of like, oh my goodness, this is something that I've been looking for and this really gives me the answers that I've been searching for. So I want to tell you a bit about my light bulb moment now so that you can get an idea of why I'm so passionate about this work and why I've dedicated my life to this work. So my light bulb moment came when I was supporting a young lady who got the highest ever score in the thinking skills assessment for Oxford University. So I think we can all agree that she was very bright, but she really struggled with the mechanics of her learning. She struggled to keep her files organized. She struggled to complete homework. She was paralysed by indecision when writing essays. She struggled to revise for exams or even access the exam hall to do an examination. And so much so that she really struggled with her mental health. She was so unsure of herself. Was she the very, very bright child that she knew she was, or was she this child that was very disorganized and that she was constantly in trouble for not doing things that she was supposed to have done? And this led to actually being hospitalised to keep her safe. And I was working as an SEN tutor supporting her to sit her A-levels from hospital, which she did, and she did very well, as you can imagine. But I was working with a psychiatrist on her particular case, and I said, I just don't understand. How can someone be so bright and so able and yet find all these basic things that she finds hard, so difficult? And the psychiatrist said, oh, you've got to read this book. It's newly published and I think it will really help you to understand. So I took the recommendation, I read the book, and it was one of those books, you know, when you read it and you're like, oh my goodness, where's this book been all my life? It helped explain to me this young lady, but also it helped to explain my life and why I had struggled when I was growing up. And so in a very neurodivergent way, because we tend to be very impulsive, I jumped on a plane over to Boston in the USA, which is where very close to where Peg Dawson, who's one of the authors, is based. She's a school psychologist and dedicated her life to this work. And I went to one of her trainings with PESI, who's an organisation over there offering psychological training. And I took her out for lunch and I said, Peg, my goodness, we need what you know about executive functions in the UK. And in her wonderful, generous way, she agreed to come over to the UK and we hosted the first ever training of executive function coaches 10 years ago now in 2015. So it's been a real journey since then, but so rewarding all along the way. So connections in mind, we believe that knowledge of our brain states and our brains helps us to be kind to ourselves and those around us. So if we can educate people about how our brains work, then that helps them to be kinder to themselves, which is the root of mental wellness, but also kinder to each other too. So excuse me, I have to say I am in a shepherd's hut, which is normally nice and quiet, but that's actually hailing outside. So if you can hear pitter pattering, I'm going to try and speak loudly so that you can hear me. But I'm sorry if that is getting in the way. It should pass, I hope, soon. So why is this important? Why is neuro-inclusion so important? Well, you're probably very aware that numbers of children with special educational needs and disabilities in the UK are on the rise. So all the figures here, but the estimates, well, the numbers, the actual statistics, I should say, is about 18.4% now, up from 17.3% last year, of children have a special educational need or disability, and almost 5% have got an EHCP, which is an education healthcare plan. And that's on the rise too. So we know that we have these rising numbers. And we also know that it is unsustainable in the current system. So this is the National Audit Office that looks at the sustainability and affordability of government services. And they have just, I mean, it's all in the figures here, but the annual budget has risen by 58% in terms of SEND provision to 10.7 billion in this year. But it has not led to better outcomes for children. There's declining confidence in the system. It's supporting 2 million children, but not meeting the children's or families' expectations. So spending all this money, but not meeting people's expectations. But also, and I think this is the real crux of it, is that local authorities who are they have given the responsibility of providing this provision are actually running at a deficit, so they cannot afford to provide what they is required in the legislature, and that's why the government is now calling, and the slide with Bridget Phillipson here in the UK, of building a system where more children with special educational needs and disabilities can attend mainstream schools, and that's central to their plans. Now, if you're calling in from another country, I'm sure there's similar debates going on, because I know that globally this is a real challenge of how do we provide for these growing numbers of children with special educational needs and disabilities. But what's really important is to know that, especially in the UK, and I know in other countries as well, that teachers really feel that they have no more capacity to give. Like providing services in their classroom for children that they have not been trained to accommodate is something that feels just completely overwhelming for most teachers. So most teachers feel that so almost 70% that they have a poor work-life balance, and it's their main cause of stress. And 97% feel that reducing workload would improve their well-being. And this is from the National Education Union survey last year. And so there is absolutely no way that we can add to teachers' workload in order to provide this provision in mainstream. We need to have radical thoughts about how we can do things differently, because lumping it onto teachers is not the answer. So moving on to neurodiversity now, and just thinking a little bit about how we've got to where we've got to, because I think it's really important to recognise that the system was set up when we knew very little about how brains actually worked and developed. And historically, it was assumed that brains were like other organs, and that they either functioned normally or abnormally, like a heart. You know, that you can have a heart that functions well and normally, or you can have a heart that has an abnormality. That can be many different things that can be diagnosed and can be fixed most of the time, or treated in some way. And it was assumed that brains were the same way. So we had all these terminologies to group symptoms together, like autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, etc., etc. All these disses and disorders and deficits to say how these brains were functioning abnormally. And it was assumed that there was kind of a normal brain function and then these various different abnormal brain functions. But actually, in the last 20 or 30 years or so, we have now found out much more about how the brain actually works. So these assumptions were made about the normal, abnormal before we knew how the brain actually worked. And now we have much better tools to understand it. It's still a developing area of science, but we know so much more than we did before. And what we now know is that there are 100 billion neurons in our brains, and they're connected together by these dendrites, these little fingers that form these webs of communication within our brains. And so actually there are trillions of connections within our brains, and that every single human being has different connections and webs of connections within their brains. And everything that we experience from before we are born shapes our brain. So there's genetics, which has kind of the blueprint, but then actually the human brain is so well adapted to our environment that it helps us to cope with the environment that we have been born into, and even before we're born as well. And so we are a product of all of the experiences that we have had throughout our lives, and our genetics as well. So now what we know from the neuroscience is there's only one certainty about brain development, and that is diversity, that there's never going to be two people who think and do things in the same way, and that diversity is the core aspect of human brain development. And so we know now that this idea of the binary normal or abnormal is just not factually correct anymore. And I like this diagram because this helps us to understand a bit more about the distribution. And I'm a geographer, I think I mentioned before. So I love a graph. And I think this helps us to understand kind of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is this idea that all brains are different. And as with everything in life, tends to fit into like a normal curve. So there's kind of an average, and then there's people who are close to the average, and then there's people who are further away from the average, and that kind of fits into a normal curve. And I was reading a fantastic book the other day about called The Canary Code, which was talking about the idea of neurotypical versus neurodivergent. So neurotypical is seen to be those normal people and the way they think normally, and neurodivergent is people with these abnormal brains, and we don't like that binary. And so actually the Canary Code was talking about, it's actually what neurotypical is people who are able to meet the expectations society has of humans in a way that doesn't impact their physical or mental health. Whereas neurodivergent people are people who are unable to meet the expectations of society without it impacting their physical or mental health. And so I really like that idea. And there's, you can imagine the kind of the blurred lines between the yellow and the blue areas on this graph. Just really helps us to understand what we're looking at here. And you may or may not be familiar with the neurodiversity movement, and I've kind of alluded to this through the last few slides, but previously we had this kind of medical model, this idea of this binary of normal versus abnormal brains, these disordered brains, people with these deficits, and that it was a hindrance if you had a diagnosis, and that the person needed fixing, that we could remedy their challenges and help them to be normal, because normal was what we were going for. But now we have the social model of neurodiversity, where we understand natural human variation and this idea of difference, not deficit, and that there's an evolutionary reason and a benefit to our species that we have these incredibly adaptable brains that help us to adapt to our environment and to think in new and innovative ways so that we can pioneer and do incredible things, which is what our species is so good at doing. And so actually, when you look at people who are very pioneering, they tend to be those on the outsides of the curve who are thinking of things in a slightly different way to those in the blue section, the normal section. So it's a real benefit to society to have people who don't think in the same way as the majority. But what we now know is that actually what's happening is there's this societal bias that disables neurodivergent people. It makes it hard for them to be their whole and authentic selves. And actually it's society that needs fixing, including schools, not the individual that needs fixing. And I think that's a really important distinction. And if you're interested in sharing this kind of concepts with your students, this is a wonderful book, which is really accessible for all age groups, Wonderfully Wired Brains, An Introduction to the World of Neurodiversity, so by Louise Gooding. So I recommend that. Okay, so on to executive functions now, which is my passion subject. So you may or may not have heard of executive functions before, and you've signed up for this webinar on neuro-inclusion, and now I'm talking about executive function. So let me just give you a little bit of a context, and then we're going to get more of a deep dive into what executive functions are. So executive function challenges underlie in the psychological research. They underlie all of these diagnoses. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, Tourette's, depression, anxiety, and many, many more of these disorders or way pathologization of natural human variations. And they all kind of categorized by this link of executive functioning, which is why it's such a powerful concept to get our heads around and for schools to embrace and understand. So I've just introduced this term, but I'd love to know, what's your knowledge of executive functions? Have you ever heard of them before I just mentioned them? Or would you consider yourself to be an expert? And Pranel's popped the link into the chat for those of you that have just joined us. Please do get involved. Fabulous. Okay, so quite a few people who've heard of them before. Some people on the other end of the scale. Now, come on, we have almost 50 people online with us today, and we've only got 20 people filled this out. So please do get involved. It really does help me to pitch my slides and make sure we're really accessing everything. Thanks, Shona. If you could pop it into the Menti, that would be great. So just follow the link and off you go. Super. So we've got lots of people who know lots about executive functions here, and that is wonderful to know, because I tell you, when we first started doing this work 10 years ago, the curve was a very different shape, much more rated towards the never heard of executive functions. So I will pitch my slides at that level, but bearing in mind that we do have some people who haven't heard of them before. So we'll make sure we cover off everyone. Super. So what are executive functions? Executive functions are the cognitive processes which are associated with our prefrontal cortex. Okay, so that's what the part of our brain behind our forehead is involved in. And they're called executive functions because they're responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks and emotional regulation. So our executive functions help us to get things done, to execute tasks. That's why they're called executive functions. And we know about them now because we have these fMRI scanners that allow us to look at the brain of live people and see that what we used to think of as character flaws are now differences in cognitive processes in our brain. And that's just so important for us to understand as teachers who are charged with developing young people's character. And who is affected? Well, every single human being on the planet has executive function strengths and challenges. So we have surveyed tens of thousands of people and working with solicitors and bankers and top executives, as well as teachers. And we have yet to find a person who has a perfect executive function profile, because it's a natural and normal part of being human to struggle with our executive functions. But what does this mean? What does executing tasks actually mean? So it's our ability to do things like this: to meet deadlines, to prioritize our work to be completed, to regulate our emotions, to inhibit our responses, so that's to stop ourselves from doing things we might instinctively want to do, to organize our belongings and keep things tidy, to organize our thoughts in paper, writing essays, reports, answers to questions on exams, to hold information in our heads when we're doing mathematics or remembering what we came into this room for, keeping time, which is a very interesting one for me as a geographer, because I've traveled a lot of the world and I've realized that different cultures have very different relationships with time. And in the West, we are obsessed with punctuality, and lots of other cultures globally are not. So something to bear in mind when we are frustrated that a child hasn't developed their time management skills yet. And finally, our ability to think flexibly. And as educators, we tend to be very flexible thinkers because we've got to serve the needs of 30 plus children within a classroom, and think on our feet if the content isn't landing well, and not to mention move all of our entire work onto online learning during the pandemic. So we have to be quite flexible as educators. So I'm going to ask you to self-reflect now. So don't think about the children in your care, but actually think about yourselves. Which of these challenges do you struggle with? And you can choose as many as you like. Please do click on the link in the chat if you've just joined us. I'd love to know which of these challenges you struggle with. Okay. Super. Right. Good. So we've got quite a few results come in now. And what I love about this is that every time we do this, there's a different distribution of challenges. And often with teachers, it tends to be around prioritizing work to be completed, just because we have so much work on, and what do you let drop? And it's all so important. So I really feel that. But really interesting to see also, across the board. I think the only one that is slightly lower is thinking flexibly, and as teachers we tend to think more flexibly. But across the board, us well-educated people attending this webinar today struggle with these executive functions, right? We struggle with them, and that means that every person in our school, including all the teaching staff, the parents, all the catering staff and cleaners, and the children themselves, struggle with these things, because it's a natural and normal part of being a human being to have executive function challenges, and strengths as well. So I want to ask you now, last time you struggled, what emotions did you feel? How did it make you feel in your body? And what emotion did that represent? And if you can pop it into the word cloud here, it will come up as a word, and then other people can see what you've put in, and that might inspire them in the words that they want to put in. And if you have put in your word already, just have a look at the words that are coming in now and just see how you might classify them. So it always it always gets me, this one. And I do this talk at least twice a week. Not this exact one, but I always have this slide in because I just think it's so powerful. Every single time that we do this, frustration and frustrated come out top. And it's so interesting to me that this is this feeling that we have associated with what's a natural and normal part of being human. It's absolutely fascinating to me. So I did a lot of research into it, as I spend my time poring over the academic research. And what I found is that frustration is a secondary emotion. It's an emotion that we often feel when our primary emotion is shame. We're ashamed of ourselves, and therefore we exhibit frustration, and we feel that frustration first because shame is a really uncomfortable emotion to feel. And it was very interesting to see shame actually coming up quite high here. So really, really interesting to see that. But we are ashamed and frustrated and overwhelmed and disappointed and angry and stressed and sad and anxious and upset about our own humanity. And that is distressing for me. It is distressing. So I want to know, what is the root cause of these painful emotions? Where do they come from? We're not born feeling ashamed when our prefrontal cortex isn't working optimally and we forget something or we lose control of our emotions. When we're a baby, if we need something, we cry for it and we don't feel ashamed about that. So our past experiences, exactly. Yes, our past experiences feed into this. very much so. High self-expectation, yeah, trauma that we might have had. And then, of course, that all comes from society, right? So, well done to those who've put society in there, but it is these external expectations that we have to be a certain type of human being, to show up in the world in a certain type of way that neurotypical people find particularly easy to do, perhaps because their brain function is most aligned with those kind of norms. But neurodivergent people it will take their toll on their physical and mental health in order to meet those expectations. And for those of you that know neurodivergent people well, or if you're a neurodivergent person yourself, you will have seen the impact of these societal expectations on people's physical and mental health. And it's something that we cannot afford to continue. We're talking about for women with ADHD die 9 years earlier on average than their neurotypical peers. That is not okay that we have a society that allows that to happen. And it's because of the societal expectations that we have that we are to be these kind of perfect humans when actually none of us are, as we've proven today. And so the root of the work that we do at Connections in Mind is helping people to understand their executive function challenges and strengths, but also of humanizing and normalizing them so that we can get to a stage where we have a word cloud that doesn't have these really negative and painful emotions, but actually has things like curiosity and interest and intrigue. Because actually, when we have those type of emotions, we're much more likely to be able to engage our prefrontal cortex and solve the problem in front of us than if we're feeling these really challenging emotions of shame and frustration. So that is at the root cause of the work that we do at Connections in Mind. So how does this play out in schools? So this unconscious bias, this societal expectations, these kind of presumptions that everyone should be able to exhibit this normal human behavior. Um, how does that kind of play out in schools? Well, in schools, you see it everywhere, to be honest, especially around behavior. And so you can see a behavior ladder here. If you're in the green zone, you've got brilliant behavior. You're meeting all those societal expectations when you're executive functioning. And if you're not, then you could get a non-verbal cue, which is really challenging if you're neurodivergent, because often you're not very good at interpreting non-verbal cues. Then you might get a verbal cue, then you'll have some kind of discussion, then a consequence, because it's presumed that if we want to learn some skills, we need consequences. But when you learn to swim, if you had consequences for not learning to swim, you'd end up drowning children, so that wouldn't work. So actually, we need to think about these things in terms of developing skills and not punishing humanity. We've got another one here. It's a very nice pictogram, here of all the children that are staying on track. These are all the neurotypical children who are meeting society's expectations. But poor Adam, Lexi, Otto, Henry, and Alexander, they are being publicly humiliated and shamed for not exhibiting these neurotypical or societal expectations in the school setting. And then you can see here, we've got another chart here. What are the habits for learning success? You've got kind of excellent, but if you look at concern at the bottom, I regularly miss my homework deadlines, which is to do with time management, planning, prioritization, and all sorts of executive functioning. I don't complete my home or classwork to an acceptable standard, again, all to do with executive functioning. I often forget my book and do not have the right equipment. That's to do with our organization, which is executive functioning. And I don't concentrate well in lessons. Again, that's to do with our executive functioning. So we shame. Schools are very good at shaming and humiliating young people who are showing natural variations in their executive functioning. And that's something that I have committed my life to changing, because that's not fair and it's damaging the mental health of our young people. So I always get very emotional about this because I'm so passionate about this work, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak to you all, and hopefully you're following along with my train of thought here and then having a few aha moments yourself. So I always like to follow that which is quite emotional with a little bit of neuroscience for a bit of light relief. So we've got here a diagram which shows the link between the 3 brain processes in executive functioning and the 11 executive function skills that we work with at Connections in Mind. So we've got cognitive flexibility, which is one of our executive functions. That's what the brain is doing. We've got our working memory, which is our ability to hold things in our short-term memory whilst we're kind of using it as a mental sketch pad. And then we've got our inhibitory control as well. That's our ability to stop ourselves from doing things we might instinctively want to do. So that's what the brain functions are. In the prefrontal cortex. But we can't actually it's not ethical for us to kind of scan the brain of all the children in our schools, not to mention expensive, to see how their prefrontal cortex is developing. But what we can measure, and what we're very good at measuring in schools, is skills. And so these are the types of skills that are associated with our executive functioning. Things like goal-directed persistence, which is like resilience or grit. We can measure that. We can measure and develop time management skills. We can measure and develop sustained attention skills. We can measure and develop emotional regulation skills. And seeing all these things, instead of seeing them as character flaws, and expecting them of children and punishing them if they don't have them, actually seeing them as skills to be developed just the same as developing our algebra skills or our tennis skills or our swimming skills or anything else along that. And I do believe that we must shift our approach to developing these parts, this part of our character or humanity, away from punishment and towards skills building. As you probably recognize, you need a lot of executive function skills for learning. So not calling out in class, being able to self-assess, writing essays, doing homework, revision, and of course exams are just embedded in executive function skills, but of course also actually the learning itself. So there's so much research about the link between executive functions and success in exams. The executive functions at reception can predict GCSE results, we know that in order to be good at maths, you need strong working memory because you've got to hold the information in your head, then your cognitive flexibility to manipulate that information, and get on with the work with using our response inhibition. And it's the same with comprehension. Any type of absorbing knowledge, manipulating that, and then recalling it requires executive functioning. So it is so embedded in everything that we do in schools. And so you may see some of these types of behaviours at the top of this iceberg. You may see children who swear, they break the rules, they have emotional outbursts, they forget things easily, they shout out in class, they're disruptive, they don't complete their homework, or maybe they just really struggle to get it down on paper. Like they're really great verbally, and then they're just really not very good at writing down what they know. Or maybe they're really quiet and compliant at school, but parents report that they are absolutely explosive at home. And all of these things can be clues that there's executive function challenges going on for a young person. And below the surface there, we know from our word cloud, we've got this shame, this feeling of guilt, feeling unlovable, fear, homeless and isolated for these young people. And the root cause of that is their executive function challenges. And that's caused either by genetics, so we know that it's very heritable, that it runs in families, but also psychological trauma, whether it's acute, so one particular event, or chronic, like being bullied, or being in a school environment where we're picked on because of our executive function challenges. Then that can also lead to executive function challenges. It can become a vicious cycle. So I'm going to move on and speak a little bit about how our brains work now, and how the prefrontal cortex isn't always online and able to do the executive functioning that we need it to do in the school setting. So we have our prefrontal cortex, where our executive functions are. That's our air traffic control center, where we think before we act. And then we have our amygdala, which is part of our limbic system, and that's our threat detector. It's constantly taking in information from our nervous system. Are we safe? Is it safe to allow the prefrontal cortex to do its work, or do I need to go into protection mode? Do I need to act before I think? So that's constantly scanning our environment. So we've got those two sections of the brain. The brain is very much more complex than that, but it just helps us to understand a bit about the brain structure. And there's this really cool hand model of the brain, which you can use with young people. So I'm going to show you how to do this now. Excuse me, the hail has gone and now the sun has come out, blinding me in my eyes, but I will continue on. So hopefully you can see my hand here, and you can see I'm folding my thumb across the palm of my hand. Now, this is my amygdala here, the knobbly bit of my thumb that sticks out. And then I've got my cortex and my prefrontal cortex here. Now, this is our whole brain state. And when our whole brain state is well, when our brain is functioning in this state, then we're able to access our prefrontal cortex and to make decisions and manage our time and write a good essay and all of these things. But when our amygdala senses any type of threat, whether real or perceived, we flip our lids and neurologically disconnect our prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala sends signals to the brain that it's got to go into fight, flight, freeze mode, and then bypasses that prefrontal cortex. So we are in much more of an instinctual mode then, and that's when we say and do things that we often later regret. Okay, and it takes milliseconds for this to happen, for us to flip our lid, and it takes on average about 20 minutes for that prefrontal cortex to come back online once the amygdala feels safe again. So I really like to think of the behaviour that we see in schools that's challenging as distress behaviour, not bad behaviour. I truly believe that no child wakes up in the morning saying, right, I'm going to really upset so-and-so today at school. They just don't do that. They have a reaction to something in their environment that's triggered them and sets them off and flips their lid. And they are distressed and they are feeling threatened. And we need to get to the bottom of what that's causing that distress to help that prefrontal cortex come back online. And for some children, it can be the school environment for the reasons that I've talked about before. And we're going to go into that in more detail now. It's also really important to remember that trauma impacts the development of the prefrontal cortex. So you can imagine from our hand model of the brain, if a child has experienced a lot of stressful events during, especially its early childhood, then it will be living in that fight, flight, freeze response with the amygdala triggered, so that becomes enlarged in the brain. We can see differences in the brain architecture. And then the prefrontal cortex itself is smaller because it's not engaged as much, it's not developing as much. So we can actually see the differences in the brain architecture of children who've experienced trauma. So they will be much more prone to flipping their lids if they have experienced trauma. And that's why we have this situation of looked after children being much highly, well, finding it much more difficult to fit in to the school environment because of the trauma that they have experienced in their formative years. We also know from the literature that there are many different factors that impact development of the prefrontal cortex as well, and our executive functions. So things like safety, I can imagine if the amygdala feels safe, then it allows the prefrontal cortex to come online. Exercise helps, connection, that feeling of love and belonging, because we feel loved, then we feel safe. When we're having fun, that means we're relaxed enough to play, and that's we're in a safe space. Joy is really important as well. When we're feeling joyous, when we're having fun, when someone's made a joke, humor can really be wonderful as a way to regulate young people. Calm, so that's our yoga, mindfulness, going for a walk in nature. Then we've got sleep. We all know how important sleep is for brain development, but especially important for executive functioning, and also food as well. When we get that hangry state, when we haven't got enough glucose to power the brain, the amygdala goes into overdrive, fight, flight, freeze, looking for food, and so we get that hangry, hungry and angry state. So I'm going to talk a bit about belonging now, because I think it's really important that we really kind of focus on belonging for young people, because a lot of children who have executive function challenges do not feel like they belong in school. But I want to just think about why it's so important to personal development. So we have this concept of neuroception, which is where the entire nervous system is feeding information to the amygdala and evaluating clues in the environment for safety, danger, or social engagement. So we're constantly scanning, subconsciously scanning our environment to make sure it's safe, that our prefrontal cortex can be online and we don't need to flip our lid and get out of there as quickly as possible. But what we have in schools is we have a situation where unexpected behavior, which is dysregulated behavior, a child is distressed, is punished. And what happens when we punish that unexpected behavior is that the child feels unwanted, alone, and misunderstood, and therefore they become more dysregulated. So the punishment itself actually makes it worse. And then you get more unexpected behavior and therefore more punishment, and so the cycle continues. And you'll see this if you look at the data of children who are regularly in detention, or have sanctions, or whatever you call it, and consequences at your school. You'll see the same people coming up all the time. And those who have the ability to stay in that normal, that neurotypical boundary of the curve will be doing that just fine. But those who are struggling will be finding that really difficult, and that will be impacting their mental and physical health as well. So punishment doesn't work. It makes it worse. But a lot of people say to me, oh, but when I do threaten a punishment to a child, they kind of shut up and they get on with it. And I was like, that's really interesting, because there's more just responses to dysregulation, the fight, and freeze. There's also one called fawn as well, which is where we comply with whatever the traumatic experience is that we're having. And so when you're seeing a child, when you shout at them or when you threaten a punishment, their amygdala has sensed that the best way to keep them safe in that environment is to comply with the person that is controlling them. And so therefore they do that in the moment, but they are dysregulated and they're not going to be engaging in the learning and not going to be doing their best work. So it doesn't work to punish children out of their executive function skills deficit. And here are some case studies to make this point. And so this is Ralia. So Ralia struggles with flexibility, metacognition, and in her school they have house parents because she's at a boarding school, and they use the behavior policy. And Ralia thinks it's unfair. Ralia becomes dysregulated and she mutters something under her breath like, "Oh, that's so unfair." Then the house parent becomes dysregulated, so they flip their lid too, and they questioned Ralia. Ralia, what did you say? Ralia loses control of her behavior and she swears at the house parent, and then the house parent escalates things according to the behavior policy. Now, when something like this happens, the house parent or the adult has a chance at this stage to step in and stay regulated, because we have much more control over our prefrontal cortex than young people do, just for the nature of the development of it. And so you can see how the reaction of adults is such an important factor in helping young people develop their executive function skills. This is Kit. Kit doesn't have a formal diagnosis, but he has sustained attention, time management, and task initiation challenges. And he is charming in class. He's really strong verbally, but he's chronically late. He's always disheveled and always has an excuse of why he hasn't done his homework. His grandmother's died 10 times this year, kind of thing. He performs well in tests, but he could do better. And the benefit of doubt is given at primary school, where he's got a good relationship with his class teacher. But secondary school, they're very strict. They've got 4,000 children, and they just don't have the time to really get to know him as an individual. And he just gets this consistent behavior points, these strikes, and then detentions. And he has this real crisis of confidence. Who am I? Am I this charming, likable young man that I was at primary school, or am I this naughty boy that's always in trouble at secondary school? And then we've got Emily. So Emily doesn't have a formal diagnosis either, but she has metacognition, flexibility, and working memory challenges. They make out-of-place comments and struggle to make friends, and they sit alone on playtimes. The other girls tease her about her shoes, and she seems engaged in school, but she's not reaching her potential. And parents struggle to get her to school. So someone's asking about these scenarios relating to university education. Yes, I mean, I could talk about that too. We're talking about schools today, but Miranda, I'd be delighted to speak to you about further education. We do a lot of work in that sector too. And here we have Leon. So Leon has sustained attention, goal-directed persistence and response inhibition challenges. School has a positive reinforcement policy, so they don't give strikes or detentions, but he starts school trying really hard, but he's on those kind of yellow sections of the graph, and so it takes a lot of effort for him to appear normal or neurotypical, and so he never gets the star of the week like the children in the blue section, and he feels really misunderstood and othered because he's trying so hard. So then he just stops trying, and his behavior seems to deteriorate because he's stopped trying. And what happens is his nervous system adapts to seek out the connection, that sense of belonging that he needs with his teachers through acting out, because he knows when he's naughty, naughty in inverted commas, that he will get that connection with his teachers. And so that vicious spiral continues from there. Oh, why is it not letting me move on? There we go. So you're probably seeing the link here between Maslow's hierarchy of needs and what we were talking about in terms of the building blocks of executive functioning. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but I just want to focus on that love and belonging section there, which is essential for self-actualization, for growth, which is what we're looking for in schools. What is belonging? What does it actually mean? So I really like this post that I saw on LinkedIn, and it talked about equality as being invited to the party, inclusion as being asked to dance. But belonging is this idea of dancing like nobody's watching, of like being your true and authentic self. And that's what we're looking for young people. We're not expecting them to perform, to pretend to be neurotypical. We're expecting them to turn up and be themselves, their true selves at school. And Dr. Brene Brown talks about how the opposite of belonging is fitting in. So if we're expecting children to change who they are and to show up in a certain way in school, and only a certain way of behaving is acceptable at school, then we are not providing a space of belonging for young people. So it's so important that we create this space of belonging. So thinking about our case study, so we had Ralia, we had Kit, we had Emily, and we had Leon. How do you think their Maslow's hierarchy of needs is going? Let's have a little bit of a reflection now for them. Onto Mentimeter. Okay, first lot are coming in now. So we don't really know much about their physiological needs, but we expect their kind of safety, love and belonging and esteem are going to be pretty low. And because of the way that they are just being made to feel like the environment that they're in wasn't designed with them in mind. And I think that's what we need to really look at when we're looking at designing neuro-inclusive environment. Thank you for that. And I'd also like just to point out as well this vicious spiral, which I've kind of talked about a bit already. But when we have these kind of experiences where we are told that we are lazy or naughty or etc., we develop poor self-talk, which results in a poor self-image, then poor performance, and then so far it goes down and down and down. And I know this from personal experience. My mental health was really affected by the way that I was treated at school because of my neurodivergence, but also from all the work that we do with thousands of young people and adults who have been through the education system, and how much it impacts their self-esteem to be constantly told that they are not doing well enough because they're not meeting those neurotypical norms. And so what we have is lots of young people who believe that they're lazy, that they're not thoughtful enough, that they're not punctual enough, that what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like everybody else? And it makes them feel like they don't belong here. And what we want to do through the work that we do at Connections in Mind is we want to be more hopeful. We want to portray these different behaviors that we would in past punish as skills, and think about things like they're working on their skills, that it's going to take time to master, that I am enough just as I am, and that my teacher understands me. And that's the kind of self-talk that we want for our young people, and that's the difference. And so we want to teach them about their brains, about the hand model, and how that works. And we want to develop these neuro-inclusive schools which nurtures the whole brain of every child. And there's 4 key factors in that. The first one is a relational approach to self-discipline. So building self-discipline. This doesn't mean having low expectations of young people, but helping them to build these skills of self-discipline that help them to participate in society in a way without judging and shaming and humiliating them, which is really, really important. So this is De Salters and also Whitaker, if you're wanting to look up authors to read more on this. And here's Laurie De Salters here. She has a wonderful book called Connection Over Compliance, which is a fantastic read, really focusing on the neuroscience of behaviour. Then we've got the focus on belonging and not fitting in. So Professor Catherine Riley, who has just retired, fantastic author on belonging and researcher, and really important work. And her book, Compassionate Leadership Through for School Belonging, is fantastic. Then it's also about talking about executive function skills. When we humanize that everybody struggles with these things, that shame and humiliation fall away. So we're talking about having teachers talk about it, students talk about it, in every single lesson reflecting on what executive function skills are we need to do this learning task today, and what strategies have we got for them. And when you see it, it's the most brilliant thing, these metacognitive young people who are able to really be aware of their strengths and challenges, support each other, and really embrace their learning. And finally, it's about teaching staff who model self-compassion and care, because just the same as young people, we need to build up our building blocks in order to use our prefrontal cortex optimally. And so if we let our building blocks run down, if we're not sleeping well, if we're not eating well, if we're not spending time with the people that we love, if we're not doing things that calm us, then we won't be able to show up in a way that means that we can be regulated and do our best work for our children. So we really need to prioritize our self-compassion and self-care in order to do that. So our approach at Connections in Mind is 3 steps. It's called Connect, Collaborate, Support. I wish I had more time today to go into all the steps of it, but we do run all sorts of training on that, which I'll get onto in a moment. Here's some further reading. I'll just leave that up for a couple of seconds so you can take a photo or a screenshot if you want. So we've got David Whitaker. He's a head teacher of PRUs and alternate provisions in the UK. We've got Laurie De Salters, which I talked about, that's the kind of neuroscience one. And then we've got some wonderful scripts from Professor Green here of how to deal with children who have behaviour challenges in school in a compassionate way. And then this is an executive function skills in the classroom. So Laurie Faith, Caroline Bush and Peg Dawson. And then we have got Compassionate Leadership for School Belonging, which is the Riley book. And then Brene Brown about leadership and vulnerability and making sure that we are modelling self-compassion and self-care. So remember that we're here to help. So we are a community interest company, a non-profit organisation, and we exist to serve our neurodivergent community. And we offer one-to-one coaching for adults and for children. We offer training in executive function coaching and what we call neuro-inclusive classroom practice, as well as inset days. And we also offer support through our online subscriptions as well. So we have 2 lots of accredited professional training. We've got executive function coach training for schools, and we've got neuro-inclusive classroom practice as well, which is the high quality adaptive teaching pedagogy that we can use in classrooms to meet the needs of all students at every lesson. And for each of those, we have 4 levels of accreditation. We have our entry level, which is level 1. Then we have level 2, which is a certificate of competence. Level 3, which is a certificate of advanced practitioner. And then finally, level 4, which is the train the trainer level. And so we require anyone who provides training through us to have gone through the process of practicing this in order to become a trainer with us. So, just to finish up now, you will find on your Menti screens that there's a little feedback form. So I'd love you to fill that out if you've got time. I know people have got to dash off, you've probably got tasks to teach or meetings to go to, but if you can fill out the feedback form, that would be really helpful. So onto Menti and it should be up there. Don't worry, you don't have to put in an email address if you don't want to, but you can give us feedback in that way, just so that I can improve this for the next time that I run it. And also so that we can pass on any information for you that you would like further. So thank you very much. Thank you for all the thank yous in the chat. It's been lovely taking you through this today and sharing my knowledge of executive functions and my earnest desire for us to create an environment where everybody is celebrated for their unique individual selves and they're not forced to pretend to be something they're not in order to fit in the school environment. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time today. And thank you for those of you that are managing to fill out the feedback form. I really do appreciate it. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Emma. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bethany. Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Lindsay. Super. Great. Well, we are at the end of our session today. So thank you for dealing with me through the hail and then the sun. We've had 4 seasons in one afternoon here in Suffolk. So I do appreciate that. And I look forward to connecting with you. Please do reach out if there's anything we can do at all to support you and your communities. That's why we exist. Oh, Emma, sunny here in Bahrain. Your lucky thing. It's probably quite a nice time of year where it's not too hot. Wonderful. Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care and go well.